One of the things I enjoy the most about my job is the fact that we're actually building something. I tell my kids as I'm driving down the freeway, hey, see those lights over there on that particular building? I built that. In the beginning of my work experience, it was more of a hustle, more get up and go, 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 go. My experience here at Cupertino has made me feel that safety isn't just important to those people in the field, or those people actually doing the work. It does come down from the top all the way down to the field. Good morning.
Morning. How you doing?
Doing well. Nice to see you again.
At Cupertino Electric, and as it relates to safety, there is no hierarchy. Whether you're an executive or a laborer, the expectation is you will stop unsafe work and you will also step in if others are in an unsafe situation. So when I think about safety, it directly ties to respect, integrity, and ultimately our people.
The pivotal moment for me when I was in the field, the general contractor at the time had taken and ultimately bid that project to lose 1 man per mile. That means 8 fatalities roughly. And the result was nobody lost their life, but we did have 4 people that were severely disabled as a result. I told myself if I was ever in a position to influence the safety performance of a company, I would take that role. We'd never look at a project that way. We're going to send people home the exact way that they showed up.
What's great about Cupertino is that they actually tell you, no, slow down, stop and think, which is a lot more comfortable for myself and for everybody who works around to know that you're in an environment where people want you safe.
When I think about safety performance, I think about one word. I think about character. Character is when you do the right thing when nobody's looking. What we're asking each individual employee to do is to look at that environment around them, understand where those hazards are coming from, taking the initial steps to neutralize them, or call a timeout.
But it's really helpful when everybody takes ownership of their own personal safety and those around them. And now you have multiple eyes. On a crew of 15 to 20 guys, you have 20 people looking out for safety versus the one foreman or the one general that's trying to run around and catch all the safety hazards.
Whenever I visit a job site, it's very important, first of all, to role model what we're expecting of our employees. And so I get myself into a mindset of really looking for hazards, looking for things that are not safe. I think it's critical that our employees are looking for that, and if we're walking the walk, talking the talk, it makes all the difference in the world.
But as long as you do it, you go home safe. And that's the ultimate goal, is to make sure you come home the same way you got there.
To foster an incident and injury-free culture at Cupertino Electric, we rely on open lines of communication between employees and management. To facilitate the exchange of information, Cupertino Electric is committed to keeping all employees informed of the requirements outlined in our IIPP, our safety manual, and the safety program through a variety of methods, including new employee orientation, weekly toolbox safety meetings held by superintendents, general foreman, or foreman, safety training typically organized by field management or the safety department, CEI Safety Flash Report, a newsletter distributed to all job sites and employees each month that highlights recent injuries and key lessons learned, Livewire, the company's intranet featuring a section dedicated to the safety department, OSHA and other safety notice postings on a job site or in your work area. Safety alerts at Cupertino Electric are used to share important safety information and fall into one of 3 color-coded categories: red, yellow, and green. Red safety alerts are used for high-risk injuries, extremely urgent near-miss events, or electrical-related incidents that require immediate action. A red safety alert will include recommendations or countermeasures to prevent similar injuries in the future. Yellow safety alerts are used for medium-risk injuries, first aid cases, property damage, and near-miss events with minimal or no injuries. Green safety alerts are informative and are used to recognize safety milestones or introduce new or updated safety procedures. These alerts will include links and resources directing employees where to go for more information. Safety teams at Cupertino Electric have been created to promote employee engagement and allow employees in the field and office to actively participate in improving safety culture and performance at CEI. For questions about the safety team, how to make suggestions, and how you can get involved, visit the Safety Department page on Livewire or contact your division superintendent, division safety manager, or the corporate safety team. Statistically speaking, the person most likely to be involved in an incident on a job site is a new employee. For this reason, we at Cupertino Electric believe in spending extra time with new employees to orient them to our safety culture and ensure that they have what they need to succeed. This is one of the best investments we can make to ensure job site safety. Upon hire at certain job sites, field employees will be individually presented a stop, talk, and accept card and sticker. The Stop, Talk, and Accept program is designed to foster and deepen a project atmosphere where all employees, regardless of trade or rank, take ownership and are given the authority and permission to take action for their own safety and the safety of those around them. New employees may also be given a First 30 hard hat sticker when they arrive on site. This sticker is a visual way to help identify new employees and encourages experienced employees to buddy up with new employees to minimize the transition trauma typically associated with a new role. After 30 days on a CEI job site, the new employee should be sufficiently oriented and is allowed to remove the sticker. Another important program instituted at the time of hire is the issuance of a Stop Unsafe Work card to new employees. This card, which is signed by Cupertino Electric's CEO, outlines our company belief that safety has no rank and should be embraced by employees at all levels. This card gives all employees the power to speak up and stop unsafe work at any time without risk of retaliation. Also included on the back of the Stop Unsafe Work card is a toll-free number for employees to submit suggestions or feedback anonymously if they desire. Cupertino Electric has a return to work policy that allows injured workers to return to work as promptly as they can safely do so. This policy is coordinated by the company's risk management department, working closely with medical providers, CEI safety professionals, and field management. Our first and highest priority at CEI is the health and safety of our employees. The return to work policy is designed to provide modified duty work that will promote efficient recovery from work-related injuries and illnesses. This return to work policy benefits both employees and CEI. In keeping with this policy, remember to report any injury or illness that you experience, no matter how small, to your foreman immediately. When assessing hazards and identifying control measures, whether that be during safety pre-task planning, performing a job hazard analysis, or developing a site safety plan development, utilize the following hierarchy of control to bolster safety on site. Before any work is done, first analyze what possible safety hazards can be eliminated. By eliminating the hazard before beginning work, you can greatly reduce the risk of possible injury. After eliminating all possible hazards, you may need to find substitute materials or equipment. The goal is to find the right tool for the job in order to make the task as safe as possible. Once you've eliminated and substituted for hazards, you may still be working in a potentially dangerous situation. This is where engineering comes in. By tweaking designs, isolating and creating barriers on site, you can make a safer workplace for everyone before any work takes place. Now that the job site is as safe as possible, it is time to communicate how any remaining hazards will be handled. This may include drafting specific procedures, having additional training, or marking dangerous areas with signage. Your very last line of defense is PPE. PPE is to be worn at all times while on a job site. No matter how much planning goes into making a job safe, there are always risks. PPE is an effective way to guard against them. As you can see, moving down the hierarchy, there is a decrease in the effectiveness of each step, and vice versa. The most effective way to work safely is to eliminate all safety hazards on the job site. On most construction sites, there are hazardous materials. Whether it's building material or naturally occurring substances, it is important to know what you are dealing with and how to handle exposure to these types of materials. In this segment, we'll be discussing 3 common hazardous materials that most tradespeople come in contact with: lead, crystalline silica, and asbestos. Lead-based paints, lead sheath wiring, and lead piping are common types of lead you might find on a job site. If you're working in an older building, be sure to ask your field team leader if there is a potential for exposure to lead and proceed accordingly. Once lead enters the body, it is very difficult to expel. Lead is toxic when breathed in or swallowed. Large amounts of inhaled or ingested lead can do serious damage, including harming the reproductive system, kidneys, brain, and nervous system. To protect yourself, be sure to wear gloves and wash hands when working with lead cable, lead anchors, or sheathing. Use WEP methods, local exhaust ventilation, or respiratory protection if you plan to work on materials containing lead. Before you use a torch for cutting, safely remove lead paint. Heating lead paint will produce lead fumes. Never smoke, eat, or drink in areas where you are working around lead surfaces. Always wash your hands and face to remove any lead dust before smoking, eating, drinking, or using the restroom. Work involving the removal or disturbance of any significant amount of lead-based paint requires awareness training, engineering controls, personal protective equipment, blood lead testing, and air monitoring. Crystalline silica is a naturally occurring material that can be generated during sandblasting, stone cutting, and drilling, chipping, grinding, or cutting concrete. At high levels or prolonged exposure to moderate levels, exposure to crystalline silica dust can cause silicosis, a serious and sometimes fatal respiratory disease. Ask your field supervisor if you suspect crystalline silica to be present in your workspace. To control exposure to crystalline silica, remember to limit the amount of dust inhaled, use engineering controls, such as using wet cutting methods and dust collection systems. Follow safe work practices, such as using wet cleaning methods and good housekeeping to prevent dust from accumulating. Make good hygiene a priority. Wash your hands before eating, drinking, or smoking. And finally, use respiratory protection if engineering and administrative controls aren't keeping crystalline silica below safe levels. One of the most common hazardous materials encountered on a job site is asbestos. Used decades ago as a building material, asbestos can be found on a job site in ceiling tile, floor tile, roofing, plaster, and spackle, installation, mastic, putty, cement board, cement pipe, and cement panels. When asbestos is damaged, it deteriorates to become airborne. Asbestos poses serious health hazards. Exposure to asbestos can lead to life-threatening illnesses that cannot be cured, such as asbestosis, the scarring of the lungs, mesothelioma, a cancer of the lungs and abdomen, and various other forms of cancer. Preventing exposure to asbestos is critical. Never disturb an asbestos-containing material. Only trained, authorized individuals should work with asbestos. If you aren't sure whether a material contains asbestos, stop and ask your foreman. If it is determined there is no airborne hazard that would require the use of a respirator, and you choose to voluntarily wear a respirator, you must sign and return Appendix D of OSHA Respiratory Protection Standard to your supervisor. Dust masks may also be made available and do not require a medical release or completion of Appendix D. Limiting your exposure to airborne particles is the best way to prevent exposure to these types of hazardous materials. At Cupertino Electric, being under the influence of or using any alcohol, illegal drugs, intoxicants, or controlled substances on the job is forbidden. If your doctor prescribes any narcotic or other medicine that may affect your ability to perform your work, you must notify your job site foreman. Your foreman or other responsible supervisor will evaluate your duties to determine the appropriateness of performing certain tasks while you are taking the prescription medication. In this instance, a doctor's written certification may also be required, stating that the prescription drug use will not affect your ability to perform your job safely. It is important to be aware that over-the-counter medications can have side effects, including drowsiness. Avoid taking anything that may reduce your awareness or ability to perform your work safely. Here are some general things to keep in mind regarding drugs and alcohol. Never work while under the influence of drugs or any other intoxicating substance. Employees in the field are prohibited from working when their abilities or alertness are compromised by fatigue, illness, prescription drugs, or over-the-counter drugs. Employees who are known to be or suspected of being under the influence of illegal drugs or intoxicating substances, or who are impaired by fatigue or illness, will be prohibited from working. Keeping our commitments to customers and the community is extremely important at Cupertino Electric. The company will comply with any drug and alcohol testing requirements mandated by a project, an owner, a general contractor, or a local union. An employee's positive test result or refusal to take a drug or alcohol test will result in discipline that can include immediate termination. Employees who maintain a Class A commercial driver's license are subject to random drug and alcohol testing as required by the conditions of that license. One last note about drugs and alcohol. Violation of Cupertino Electric's prohibition against drugs and alcohol could be cause for disciplinary action, up to and including immediate termination. Don't risk it. When hired, all CEI employees participate in new employee orientation to review general health and safety expectations and work practices. This is supplemented with a site-specific safety orientation to cover unique hazards, site emergency response procedures, and other information specific to the employee's role or work location. At your work location, whether it's a job site or an office, be aware of where nearby emergency equipment is located, including fire extinguishers and first aid kits. It is also important to know and understand the emergency response procedures and evacuation plans for your specific work location. The following steps should be followed when responding to an early stage fire. Sound the fire alarm and call the fire department if appropriate. If the fire is too large or if you have the slightest doubt about your ability to fight a fire, evacuate immediately. Identify a safe evacuation path before approaching the fire. Do not allow the fire, heat, or smoke to come between you and your evacuation path. Select the appropriate type and size fire extinguisher. Ensure the fire extinguisher is fully charged and inspected. Discharge the extinguisher within its effective range using the pass technique. Pull, aim, squeeze, sweep. Pull the pin. This will break the temper seal. Aim low, pointing the extinguisher nozzle or its horn or hose at the base of the fire. Do not touch the plastic discharge horn on CO2 extinguishers. It gets very cold and may damage skin. Squeeze the handle to release the extinguishing agent. Sweep from side to side at the base of the fire until it appears to be out. Watch the area. If the fire reignites, repeat steps 2 through 4. Back away from an extinguished fire in case it flames up again. Evacuate immediately if the extinguisher is empty and the fire is not out.
Hazard communication is the OSHA standard that ensures your right to know about the chemicals and materials you're exposed to in the workplace. Hazard communication, also known as Hazcom, affects all companies and locations where Cupertino Electric works. This includes existing facilities with ongoing customer operations and new construction projects. The Global Harmonized System, also known as GHS, is an international standard adopted by the United States to ensure all product labels have the same consistent information. GHS also standardizes all safety data sheets. Safety data sheets in the past were called materials safety data sheets. Past MSDSs were often highly technical, and there was no consistent format to locate important information quickly. GHS fixed that problem, ensuring that SDSs are consistent and easier to understand. Today, we take it for granted that a chemical or product we use at work will have a label with accurate and complete information. You also may take it for granted that if you wanted to know about the hazards of a chemical, you could just ask your supervisor or a safety person. But this was not always the situation. The Hazard Communication Standard became U.S. law in 1982 and requires that all employees, including you, have access to accurate information about chemicals in the workplace. Before 1982, most employees were not informed about chemical hazards. No doubt there were thousands of people who developed serious health problems and diseases from workplace chemicals without knowing it. The Hazcom standard requires all employers, including Cupertino Electric, to have a written program available to all employees with specific information such as identifying a designated program coordinator and a chemical inventory for each work location. The Hazcom standard also requires that all chemicals and products have labels, including secondary containers. Safety data sheets must be readily available for all products we use. And most importantly, training must be provided on the hazards and safety precautions for the chemicals we use. In addition, we may need to provide training for chemicals when we perform work at a facility where the owner uses a certain chemical in its processes. Before we begin work at that facility, we will review the SDS and the owner's procedures for that chemical. Finally, we must review our written Hazcom program annually and make sure our inventories and SDSs are up to date. Your responsibility as an employee of Cupertino Electric is to always ask and to seek information if you don't know the hazards of a chemical or if you are unsure how to protect yourself. You must also know how to respond in an emergency. An emergency could be anything from an accidental splash into the eyes, a spill, or a fire. As an employee of Cupertino Electric, there are two ways you'll receive information about a chemical: a formal or semi-formal meeting with your supervisor or someone knowledgeable about the chemical, and through self-learning by reading the label and SDS. An example of this would be your foreman reading the sections of an SDS to you and coworkers at a morning meeting before you begin using a chemical or a product. Or you can read the product label, go to the SDS binder and read through the SDS yourself. You can even ask for a copy of the SDS to take with you. The Hazcom standard requires that all SDSs be readily available at every work site. Part of your site-specific orientation will include the location of the SDS binder. On some locations, we may have access to our SDSs using a software program or a tablet. The purpose of Hazcom and GHS is actually quite simple: to inform you about the hazards of the chemicals you are going to use, how to protect yourself during normal use, and what to do if there's some type of an emergency or dangerous unwanted exposure to you or your coworkers. And because the Hazcom standard and GHS are national standards, no matter where we work, the owner of active existing facilities, as well as the general contractor and other subcontractors on a new construction project, must all have SDSs for every chemical on the site. In any case, if you find a chemical on your project and want or need the SDS, you can always do a web search.
Chemical hazards can be described in two ways: acute and chronic. An acute hazard, as you can imagine, causes immediate injury or illness. Think about a splash of acid into the eyes, an immediate acute injury. Acute usually means a very short period of time, typically less than 24 hours. A chronic hazard is primarily an illness that affects our health after a longer exposure. Think about someone who worked with asbestos for 20 years and now have lung cancer. Of course, many chemicals will impact their health much faster than 20 years, and some will produce headaches, dizziness, or skin irritation long before other chronic health problems, such as organ damage and cancer, develop. Fortunately, both the GHS label and the SDS identify the health hazards that can cause illness and disease. The SDS will also indicate the ways chemicals can enter our body, and these include absorption through the skin and the eyes, inhalation by breathing in fumes, vapors, mists, or gases, ingestion by swallowing the actual chemical or by swallowing food products that have been contaminated somehow with the chemical, injection by some type of device such as a needle or sharp metal. An open cut that allows a chemical to directly enter the body is also an example of injection. In some cases, a person will eat food or smoke with unwashed hands, and if they were not wearing protective gloves, their hands will contaminate the food or the cigarette, which they then ingest or inhale. A GHS compliant label and SDS will typically describe hazards in two ways: physical and health. A pictogram will be present on all labels and SDSs to make hazard recognition faster and easier to understand in all languages. Typically, physical hazards can be any one of the following or several combined: explosive, flammable, oxidizer, self-reactive, pyrophoric, self-heating, corrosive, and gas under pressure. A health hazard relates to the harm it can do to the human body. The GHS label and SDS will list many of the following health hazards. And just like physical hazards, a chemical or product can have one or more health hazards. And these include skin corrosion or irritation, serious eye damage or eye irritation, respiratory irritation, germ cell mutation, carcinogen, reproductive toxicity, specific organ toxicity, asphyxiation. There is another additional type of health hazard description under GHS called hazards not otherwise classified. This is a chemical with hazardous health effects, but the specifics have not been identified.
At Cupertino Electric, we follow the same hierarchy of hazard controls for chemicals as we do for all of our work tasks. As part of the safety pre-task plan and the JSA, we should always ask if we can eliminate the use of a chemical or product, especially if it has some type of physical or health hazard. The simple question we should ask is, do we really need to be using this chemical? Do we really need this product for the work task? Determining if we can substitute a hazardous product for a less hazardous or even non-hazardous one is often called product substitution. An example would be using a water-based paint in place of a flammable oil-based paint. Engineering means using some type of machine or device to reduce or eliminate the hazard. When it applies to chemicals, this typically means using powered ventilation, such as fans, to remove the airborne hazard. When we use communication and controls, we are usually talking about training, procedures, instruction, and setting up barricades. And of course, the last level of protection we should rely on is PPE, personal protective equipment. When engineering and work practice controls cannot fully protect us from an exposure, PPE is used. Typical types of PPE used for chemical protection include safety glasses, goggles, and face shields. Hand protection in the form of impermeable gloves that will resist the chemical's properties and won't decompose or leak. In some cases, we will wear impermeable boots or spats to cover the top of the boot. Hard hats for basic head protection, and in some cases, hoods to cover the head, neck, and ears. Body aprons or full body suits. Respiratory protection in various levels, from simple half-face particulate filters to full-face respirators with supplied air. One thing to remember about relying solely on PPE is that if the PPE fails in some way, you will be exposed. This is why we always want to try to eliminate, substitute, or engineer the chemical hazards out of our work tasks. All containers of hazardous chemicals supplied to the workplace must be labeled. The labels on containers delivered to our work locations must be legible and kept intact. Frequently, it is necessary or more efficient to transfer a chemical to a smaller, portable, secondary container. A GHS compliant label is also required on all portable and secondary containers. All GHS compliant labels must have the following information: product identifier, signal word, hazard statement, pictogram, precautionary statement, supplier identification. A product identifier is the name and number that accurately identifies the chemical. There are tens of thousands of chemicals in use around the world, and having an accurate name is essential in matching the chemical to its SDS. The signal words tell the relative severity of the hazard. Danger is used for more severe hazards. Warning is used for less severe hazards. Hazard statements describe the nature and degree of the hazard. The hazard statement can include information about the exposure being either fatal or toxic, causes organ damage, or describes routes of exposure. For example, a hazard statement could say highly flammable liquid or may cause liver or kidney damage. The precautionary statement describes recommended measures that should be taken to minimize or prevent adverse effects that would result from an exposure to the chemical. 4 types of precautionary statements appear on a chemical label: prevention, response, storage, disposal. Unique to GHS are the pictograms. Pictograms are symbols intended to convey specific information about the hazards of a chemical. They appear on a white background with a diamond-shaped red border. There are 8 mandatory symbols used in pictograms: flammable, oxidizer, explosive, corrosive, gas under pressure, acute toxicity, irritants and sensitizers, health hazard with a specific toxicity. A 9th pictogram indicates an environmental hazard. Supplier identification includes the name, address, and telephone number of the manufacturer, supplier, or importer. Under GHS, the safety data sheet is the most important source of chemical and product-specific information. The SDS contains a detailed written description of the chemical or product and describes its hazards, as well as the precautions and remedies for releases and exposures. The SDS must always be readily available for all chemicals on a project or work location. Before using a chemical or product, the SDS should always be reviewed. In compliance with GHS, the SDS is organized and consistent with 16 mandatory sections. Section 1 contains the product and company identification. Section 2 contains the hazard identification. Physical and health hazards are identified along with the corresponding pictograms. The signal word and precautionary statements with prevention and response instructions are also in Section 2. You don't have to hunt around multiple pages to find the hazards of a product. It is always in Section 2. Section 3 contains composition and information on ingredients. Section 4 contains first aid measures. Section 5 contains firefighting methods. Section 6 contains accidental release measures. Section 7 describes safe handling and storage. Section 8 describes exposure controls and personal protection. Exposure limits for the chemicals contained in the product are listed, as well as the required and recommended PPE. Section 2 and Section 8 are possibly the 2 most important sections you need to know. Section 9 lists the physical and chemical properties. Section 10 details the stability and reactivity properties. Section 11 contains toxicological information, and Section 12 lists the ecological information. Section 13 describes disposal considerations. Section 14 contains transportation information, and Section 15 details the regulatory information unique to the chemical or chemicals in the product. Section 16 is called Other Information. This can include the date of the last revision of the SDS, disclaimers, and other information the manufacturer considers important or unique. Knowing the proper emergency procedures when something goes wrong while using a chemical or product is essential to everyone's safety on the work site. Read the SDS before using the product and discuss the methods for emergency response at the safety pre-task meeting. Ensure that you have the supplies, equipment, and necessary training to respond effectively in an emergency. Hazard communication in GHS may sound complicated, but it's actually really simple. Open communication and information about the chemicals and products you can be exposed to. Labels on all containers and safety data sheets available for every chemical and product on the work site. Hazard communication, or Hazcom, is the OSHA standard that ensures your right to know about the chemicals in the workplace. The Global Harmonized System, also known as GHS, is the standard that ensures all product labels and safety data sheets have the same consistent information. The purpose of Hazcom and GHS is to inform you about the hazards of the chemicals you use, how to use them safely, and what to do in case of an emergency. Hazcom requires all employers to have a written program with specific information, including a designated program coordinator, a chemical inventory, and safety data sheets. Training is provided through meetings and by self-learning. The harm a chemical can have on us is described in two ways: acute and chronic. Acute means immediate. Chronic means long-term. The ways a chemical can enter our body to cause acute or chronic harm include absorption, inhalation, ingestion, injection. A label and SDS will describe hazards as either physical or health using a pictogram. Physical hazards include explosive, flammable, oxidizer, self-reactive, pyrophoric, self-heating, corrosive, gas under pressure. Health hazards include irritation and damage to skin, eyes, respiratory system, germ cell mutation, carcinogen, reproductive toxicity, specific target organ toxicity, asphyxiation. To control chemical hazards, we use the hierarchy of hazard controls: eliminate, substitute, engineer, communication, PPE. Remember, relying solely on PPE is the least effective control. A GHS compliant label must have the following information: product identifier, signal word, hazard statement, pictogram, precautionary statement, supplier identification. There are 8 mandatory symbols used in pictograms: flammable, oxidizer, explosive, corrosive, gas under pressure, acute toxicity, irritants and sensitizers, health hazard with a specific toxicity. The safety data sheet, or SDS, must be readily available for all the products we use. Read the SDS before using a chemical product. Know the hazards, precautions, and emergency procedures. The SDS has 16 sections. Section 2 contains the hazard information. Sections 4 and 5 contain first aid and firefighting methods. Sections 6 and 7 contain spill and safe handling information. Section 8 describes exposure controls and personal protection. Ensure that you have the supplies, equipment, and training to respond effectively to any kind of exposure or emergency.